Welcome everybody to the Level Up Consulting Partners Know Before webinar, Data Mapping and Gap Analysis. My name is Dave Cohen. I'm a Senior Manager at Level Up Consulting Partners. I'd like to welcome everybody here to the program today. We've got a great program set up for you. And we're gonna get started in just a minute. But before we do, I wanted to share with you just a few program details. Many of you are probably already wondering about a copy of the slides. We do have a great slide deck for you, some really good materials. And we will be making that available to the audience. We're going to be putting that together in PDF form and sending that out in an email early next week, along with a link where you can view a recording of the program that you're about to see as well. So please know that you will get a copy of the slides and be able to access a recording of this program, and that should be out early next week. Also want to let everybody know that we encourage questions throughout the program here today. We are going to accept those questions through either the chat function that's down at the bottom of your screen or the question answer panel. So feel free to go ahead and submit those throughout. We're going to get through the presentation, and then we've designated some time toward the end for a panel Q&A, at which time we'll also field the audience questions. So please submit them throughout the program, and then we will handle them then. So with that, let me move on. I'd like to kind of quickly sketch out what we're going to be looking at for a structure for today's program. In a minute, I'm going to introduce our two expert panelists. You'll get a chance to meet them and hear a little bit about their backgrounds. Then we're going to start with some definitions because there's something to be said here about the definitions of data mapping and gap analysis. People consider them in different ways. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and why that's important at the beginning of the project. Then we're going to talk about some essential practices. And again, our two panelists today have a lot of experience with this. And we're going to talk about some things that you want to keep track of very early on the project and how important those are. Then we're going to move into this concept that this is not a static exercise, but a dynamic one. For those of you that are joining us today that have never engaged in a data mapping or information mapping exercise and or gap analysis, it is not something that you do once and then are done with. And so we're going to talk into how that works and ways to structure things from the beginning so that you can continue to incorporate new information as it becomes available to keep things fresh, dynamic, and up to date. Then importantly, we're going to talk about socializing, reporting, and metrics. This is critically important because if you and your team are doing all this great work, it's very important that it get communicated out to the organization. And we're going to focus in on two specific audiences. We're going to talk about the reporting back out to the functional teams that you're working with so that there's a onward communication and a two-way flow of communication between the functional teams that you're working with on your asset mapping, and also reporting up to management, to executive level management. It's important that they know what's going on and that they're getting the right information that they need so that you can keep your good work moving forward. Then we're going to have a panel discussion, as I mentioned earlier, and we'll be able to field some questions, and I have some questions prepared for the panelists as well. So with that, let me introduce today's panelists. And I'd like to start with Alessio De Paula. Alessio currently serves as Vice President of Data Protection at KnowBe4, where he's responsible for seeing that global data protection requirements are being identified and met. Alessio has extensive experience in many European and United States privacy laws, including the GDPR, CCPA, and HIPAA. And he focuses on bridging the gap between privacy and security in the effort to create a robust data protection program there at KnowBe4. And Alessio holds his CISSP and AWS security certifications. He's a certified fellow of information privacy, and he holds the CIPP US, Europe, and Canada certifications from the IAPP. We are very happy to have him on the program with us today. Welcome, Alessio.
Yep. Thanks, Dave. Happy to be here.
And joining Alessio on the panel, Colin Brown is a director with us here at Level Up Consulting Partners. In this role, Colin co-manages our core service offerings and leads our management consulting and third-party risk management services while supporting our strategic initiatives. He has over a decade of experience providing strategic consulting services to organizations ranging in size from small private enterprises to Fortune 500 companies. Colin, really appreciate you taking a little bit of time away from your client work to join us today.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, great to be here.
Excellent. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Colin to begin our first section. And we are going to, I'll pop off and then I'll come back on when we get to the audience Q&A.
Well, thanks a lot, Dave, and good afternoon or good morning to everyone. When we were kind of planning out what we wanted to cover in this discussion, around data mapping and gap analysis. We really wanted to keep it principles focused. So not so much a how-to on how to do a data mapping or how to do a gap analysis as there's a lot of variation between different companies in how you might do that, but rather keep it focused on the principles of what can determine the success or the lack of success with a data mapping and with a gap assessment. And a natural place to start for us was to define a couple things up front and kind of set a standard for what we mean by data mapping. Dave mentioned in the beginning, that term can mean a lot of different things to different people. If you're a data management professional, you might think of data mapping from a translation and migration perspective. The way we're using it today and the way we're thinking about data mapping that we often work with our clients on is identifying and documenting the who, what, where, when, and for what purpose we're processing personal data. So we're thinking about it very much from a privacy, risk, and compliance perspective. So what are the common elements in that type of data mapping? We've listed 4 things on the bottom here that we think are really critical that need to be incorporated into any data mapping. The first of those is obviously your processing activities. When you think about what a processing activity means, the GDPR requires organizations that are subject to it to have a ROPA, a record of processing activities. So it very much forms the foundation of your ROPA. But what we find is that the definition of a processing activity can be very ambiguous. But at the second point here, the applications, third parties, and service providers, that is an inventory of those is one of the natural outputs of your ROPA, of your information mapping or data mapping, whatever you're calling it. You want to walk away with a good understanding of which assets, collect, store, and transmit data, which third parties or service providers you might be transferring data to or from. And that starts to make the idea of an information map a little bit more concrete, right? Those are the supporting mechanism for your processing activities. And then the third point to that is data flows. It's a natural offshoot of what I just talked about. If you have a good map of your assets, your third parties, you can start thinking about where does data flow from one entity to another, whether that's an intracompany transfer, whether that's between your organization and another. A lot of people are very concerned about cross-border data transfers, right? So in an ideal world, you walk away from a data mapping knowing where those transfers are taking place so that you can then do the subsequent evaluation, right? The subsequent analysis of whether or not you have a lawful basis for it and everything else. And then the last point here, the other attributes, this is where we can start cherry picking, whatever's right for one of our clients. So while the first 3 points are critically important, you then have the ability to kind of customize and tailor your data map or your information map to what your needs are. I mentioned lawful basis earlier. That's very much a GDPR concept, but you might look at you could think of them as controls, right? So against each asset that shows up in your map, do you want to understand, are there additional attributes about an asset or a third party that you might want to understand? So these are, as I said, from a foundational perspective, what we're referring to as a data map. If you're approaching a data map for the first time, these are the types of questions. I'm going to use this expression a couple of times. Those are the types of questions that we want a data map to be able to answer for us. And as we go on to the next slide here, we're going to similarly kind of level the expectation of what we mean by gap analysis. It is also a word that can mean, or a phrase that can mean different things to different people. And I think the reason for that is because a gap analysis can happen at many different levels. So, a properly scoped gap assessment usually operates, this is kind of my model that I've built for doing a gap analysis, but it usually operates at one of these 3 levels. If we start at the bottom of our pyramid here, we have our program strategy, right? So that's looking at whether that's your privacy program, your information security program. That's thinking about strategically, am I headed in the direction that I need to be headed in based on my business objectives and my compliance requirements? So if you're the first privacy hire in your organization, you might be doing a gap analysis to determine, I'm subject to the GDPR, or I will be subject to the CPRA. What are the things that I need to have in place? And do I have those in place or not? That leads us kind of one level up the pyramid there. We think about our policies, our standards. I think of these as the compliance artifacts that you might have in place to address those requirements that you've determined. Strategically, I need to do this. The next level up is I put mechanisms in place that evidence that I am aligning with what is required. And then at the tip of this pyramid, at the most granular level, we have our controls, our practices, those other things that we do to actually put what the policies and standards say into practice, right? This is where the rubber meets the road for, solving privacy and data protection challenges. And this is where we do gap analysis that's much more focused perhaps on a framework, right? Where we're looking at, a framework of data protection controls, and we're saying, I have an inventory of applications. Do those applications meet that? Do they have the necessary controls in place? If not, where are my gaps? What are my kind of remediation steps that I need to take? So again, just kind of leveling the expectation on what we mean by gap analysis here. And on the next slide, just to kind of close out this section, I think it's important to understand how they work together. A lot of times our first engagement with a client is performing the two concurrently or performing them, one after the other. And it's because they really complement each other well. Your data map, if you're in a position where you really have a solid understanding of the types of data that you process, where it gets processed, you probably have a good understanding of what as I said, your compliance requirements or your objectives might be. So the gap analysis at that point might be a more straightforward exercise. But oftentimes what we find is the data map understanding the different types of data you process, where it gets processed, that is going to feed into how you perform your gap analysis. It's going to inform you what your different requirements are, especially if you've never done a data mapping, if this is kind of your first gen data mapping, it's going to help you understand, what do I need to look at from a gap perspective? So really, step one in this, be realistic, I think, about where your organization is from a maturity perspective. Have these things been done in the past? And if so, the principles we focus on here are really each time you iterate on your program is the opportunity to incorporate some of these principles. Either one of these can be a first step. They can be performed concurrently, but we really do find that it becomes part of this like cyclical, type of wheel here where one thing just continuously feeds the next. And then just to kind of hammer the point home a little bit, understanding what questions you're trying to answer. I'm very big on that and making it plain English. And I know Leslie is going to pick up more on that, on how to make it practical. And that's going to be a theme here, but really be clear on what questions you want each thing, a data map or a gap analysis, to answer. So with that, I will pass it over to Leslie, and we're going to do a little bit deeper dive on gap analysis.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, and what Colin said about really having a firm understanding of what questions you're trying to answer is going to guide you through this whole process. If you don't know what you want to answer or what questions you're trying to answer, it's pretty much going to stop you from moving forward or doing anything, which kind of goes into the first part of the 5 principles here. So also, as Colin mentioned, we're not going to go too in depth, like a step-by-step guide, because there's tons of stuff you can also find online. You can find like SWOT analysis, McKinsey 7S model, there's business compliance analysis. There's so many different ways you can approach it. These are just some practical things you can do, and it really just takes some of the stuff from those frameworks into the simplest level on how you can apply them to your organization. But as for the 5 principles, really, you want to identify what driver you have. The question that I kind of live by here at KnowBe4 is, what is the problem I'm trying to solve? And if I can't answer that question very, very clearly, then I can't move forward with what I'm trying to do because I don't know what I'm trying to fix. So identifying your driver could come from a variety of places. It could be you have regulatory requirements. Maybe you have to comply with PCI DSS, or maybe you have legislative requirements. You need to comply with GDPR or CCPA, or it could come from something else. Maybe there are other questions that you asked yourself. Usually when you approach yourself as asking a question, think of like, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What are your competitors doing? So really, you could ask yourself some questions like, what are competitors doing in this space? It could be you sell a certain product, your competitors are getting these certifications, improving their security posture. Other questions, what are my compliance requirements? Or another one could be, what sort of negative feedback am I getting from my customers? if you're getting a lot of negative feedback, let's say this is specific to privacy, about your privacy practices or your security practices, well, then that's something you should look into, gather some more data and see if it's something that you want to change. Secondly, how does it help the business? Really, you want to align yourself with the business. That will make this process a whole lot easier. How can you really see where the business wants to be in 5 years? Maybe they're going to expand internationally, and you want to take that approach as you go through this and see what you want to do from a privacy or otherwise security perspective. As for defining your current state, you want to be brutally honest with yourself. You don't want to say, oh, this is a little bit partially implemented, or we have a little bit of this. No, it's, when you're assessing yourself against whatever framework, let's say it's like an ISO framework, be brutally honest with everything that you do. Don't leave any room for doubt, because that's going to affect your output or your future state, which will make things difficult. And then have a very defined target state. You want to be realistic, but you also don't want to limit yourself too much. You want to make sure that you have your vision for where you want to be. It's not too outlandish, but it's something that you can achieve. But don't limit yourself too much based off those resources that you may not have right now, or some other tech that you might not have right now. And then you're also going to identify your gaps and remediate them and figure out what you have to do. And we can go a little bit more into that on the next slide, Dave. All right, so visualization helps. Sometimes when you just see a bunch of words and you start thinking through things, it doesn't make as much sense. You could do kind of like a visual flow chart, or this is like a value flow chart, I think it's called, and just boil it down to something super, super simple to see what you want to do. So for here, this is an example from KnowBe4, something that we did. We wanted to improve our posture from a security and privacy perspective. And we wanted to scope that out and make it super specific. So it was for our SaaS product. So we had to see, okay, what do we have currently? Well, we had our SOC 2, but that wasn't cutting it. We had some data to support that our customers wanted something else. They wanted something more. Going back to kind of that negative feedback, it's not super negative. We're doing the security things, but we don't have what they want. This is what they're requesting. So we put that there as one of the drivers. We got a lot of data. We noticed the sales teams were saying, hey, we need this. Sales leadership also understood the need for it. So we created a plan to get those ISO certifications, 27,000 series, and then all the other privacy ones that come with it as well. Kind of set out our future state map, what we wanted to do, what we wanted to accomplish. Because once you get your certification or once you do your audit, really, you start getting some things that could be improved, but you don't need to improve, which are the OFIs. So we added that in there. We wanted to remediate all findings, and also based off how ISO work, it's like a plan, do, check, act model. So it's a little different than the SOC 2 was. We identified the completion date and identified what resources we would need as well to do that. And it involves a lot of various different departments, and you really need to identify those resources there, or your inputs, or teams, or people, technology that is going to help you along the way for you to accomplish what you want to do. But overall, for the value flow chart, just keep it super simple. Don't make it too difficult. The simpler you make it, the easier it is to identify the problem and come up with a solution. And on the next slide here, we can go over some of the roadblocks that you might encounter. And the biggest one is you not identifying the driver or the problem. I've had my fair share of times where I thought something was a problem, and then I really started digging deeper, and it really wasn't. You can do things like the 5 whys method. I do like that one. You can just keep asking yourself why over and over and over to figure out, okay, what is the real issue here? Another one is changing how you're assessing your current state in your future state. Basically, you want to keep that static, because you want everything to be assessed against the same thing. You don't want to start changing the process or moving I can't think of the word, like flagpoles or something, moving the posts. So you want to just kind of keep that static. As for improper categorization, that's really not identifying all the appropriate resources or technology, or seeing what departments or other organizational resources are going to play a part in what you're trying to do. So, that comes into scoping as well. So, for us, let's say we're undergoing an audit, we want to scope the audit. And then once that audit is scoped, we really want to know, okay, what are all of the things that are going to play a part in this? And if you miss a few, it's going to cause issues in the future for you during basically, the entire process. And you're going to have to go back and remediate those. But that usually takes up a lot of time just because maybe whatever it wasn't prepared, or the people that you may need don't have the time for it, or let's say the technology didn't meet certain requirements. So it's really something you got to take into account. And then we also already discussed placing limitations on the future state as well. So, you may not have all of the resources right now to do everything. But in the future, you really want to see, okay, well, in this future state, what resources will I need to maintain what I have or what I want or what we're trying to accomplish? So, you really want to think of it from that perspective. And then now I can hand it over to Colin, who is going to go over some data mapping with you guys.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Alessio. So much like we talked about some principles there to focus on data mapping or on gap analysis, we're going to try to do the same thing on the data mapping side and also look, at more of what I would call the success factors. And a lot of that comes down to making things very practical. And Alessio talked about scoping and planning, and that's going to be kind of the theme of the next couple of slides we run through here. So on this slide here, very big on, it sounds very, very kind of trivial, but in our experience, I see clients oftentimes not spend the appropriate amount of time up front to scope and plan for a data mapping exercise. A lot of times they will bring us into an engagement and immediately want us to jump in with, in-person interviews and outreach throughout the organization. We've highlighted 4 points here that I think are really helpful to invest in upfront. The first of those is being very clear about the ownership of this data mapping. Who's going to own the successful delivery of that data mapping? Can you syndicate that ownership out? While there may be one owner, I think every party needs to feel like they have a vested interest if they're being asked to contribute to it in some way. And it makes really clear, I talked earlier about knowing what questions you want to answer. Defining that ownership up front is going to help drive who is going to provide input on that. What should our data map look like? The second thing is being very thoughtful about how we're engaging teams. I don't think it's unreasonable for a data mapping effort to develop a communications plan and start to execute that very well in advance of the actual outreach for a data mapping effort. The key point here is making sure that if you're asking business leaders throughout your organization to participate in this, they need to understand why it's important. You have to be realistic about timelines and competing priorities. That doesn't mean being soft and being beholden to everybody else's schedule. You also have a timeline on which you need to get things done. But I think it really helps to set those expectations up front. And then the last bullet point here, figure out how to make it valuable for other teams. I think this is a big miss for organizations that do a data mapping. So for example, we've had clients where the privacy team will be spearheading a data mapping effort, and they haven't thought about how they might partner with a security team or somebody else in a risk and compliance role to say, you know what, we're going through this large exercise with a lot of outreach and we're going to, get some questions answered. Is there something that we could track down that would also be useful for you? Well, what I find there is that sometimes expanding your scope by 5% can yield an outsized benefit for other teams and prove that you're kind of a partner, a long-term partner for them. So that's a big kind of pet peeve of mine if that's not part of the thought process. Sometimes it's not possible, but I think it should be the goal where it is possible. And then on the next slide, the last, 2 things, I think last success factors here, communication channels really picks up on that engagement piece. How are we going to communicate this out? What best suits our culture? I think that a lot of times our clients may be selling their culture short a little bit, where they think we need to go and be face-to-face with these people, the business owners, the application owners, to do the data mapping, when really implementing some sort of survey tool or an automation method that has its own set of risks with it as well. And you need to be realistic about those, whether it can solve the total scope that you're looking to gather. Those are all things that make it a risky proposition. But think about what other initiatives have been performed at your organization and what fits your culture. And then I've already mentioned the last point here, clarifying expectations up front, determining what the output is going to look like, what questions it's going to answer for us, and then what inventories do I need to create. Sure, I understand my processing activities, but am I expecting to have a full inventory of IT assets? How do I think about third-party assets versus internally hosted and managed assets, right? If that's how your organization operates, how do I categorize those between the two lists, right? All questions that can be dealt with in the planning phase. And so from here, we've talked about data mapping out. I know Lesio's got some examples to really make some of these things a bit more concrete. So I'll pass it back to him.
Yep. Thank you, Colin. And Colin has done a great job providing an overview of data mapping. And I think one key point that he hit on very well is the expanding your scope by 5%, and just really partnering with other groups. Once other groups see you as an asset, it will make things a lot easier for you, especially when you're working with them in the future. They will actually proactively start reaching out to you about things that they see that may affect you. I've seen that happen here at Know before, and I've been here 4 years, and the more I partner with other teams, the more they provide value back, basically, and it's super helpful. But we can start here on the next slide. I figure we can start a little bit with the common problems. The number one for me that I've encountered is not customizing the process. I'll use like technology as an example, getting a privacy GRC tool and just trying to use some of the native stuff that they have in there. And to me, I was like, well, this is all good, but it doesn't really fit what I'm trying to do right now based on how my team is. So I really had to do a lot of customization. A super easy example is just making your own categories of data for what particular things that you're doing. Let's say you have a product. Well, you can create your own categories so you don't have to just keep clicking all these various categories. I kind of approach it from like an app dev perspective. Reduce the amount of clicks you have to do. If you can reduce the amount of clicks you have to do, you keep it simple. You can do that again. It's repeatable. It becomes more scalable. So really customize your process if you use a tool like that. Reduce the amount of clicks that you have to do. That'll make it a lot more repeatable and scalable and easy for you. Another one, same thing, tool, or you can use Google Drive. It doesn't matter what it is. Not having a centralized database makes it difficult, especially if you're a larger organization and you have multiple privacy teams. Maybe they're not all under one umbrella. You have to start tracking things down. You want to have a centralized database that's auditable, something that you can easily present evidence to an auditor or whomever that this thing was accomplished, and you can refer back to it and you can update it. Prioritization is huge as well. If you're a one-man shop and you go into an organization, say it's 500 employees, you're not going to be able to do everything. You're not going to be able to map everything. There are so many different processing activities going on in the organization. So really focus on what's important to the business and what is high risk. And ultimately what you see is super important privacy wise. It could be things that are processing customer data that you're more worried about. Or it could be something else, but really focus on those large risks and those things that you can control, and really just prioritize, because there is some level of risk you're going to have to accept, which goes into risk acceptance. Here we have a risk management program where people or various sector heads are able to accept the risks that we identify and provide to them. So I think the risk acceptance part becomes more difficult, just because, data mapping, you are going to find problems. And if you don't know what to do with them, you're kind of in this weird place in the middle. You're trying to figure out, all right, what do I do with this information? So finding a way to relay those risks to the business and have whoever needs to accept that risk, accept the risk. And I can move to the next slide to go over a more so real life example of data mapping. And this is, more of a privacy operational standpoint. Let's say we're trying to create a data lake, and our team wants to use this data lake for customer health, basically to see, all right, well, is the customer using the platform? Are they at risk for not renewing? Do they not like the platform? Well, you're going to need a lot of data for that. So the best way to kind of approach that from a privacy perspective is a data map. So I kind of break it down into 4 steps here. Start with an architectural style diagram. I think those make it a whole lot easier. And you'll see on the next slide when we get to it. You want to identify the key systems and components and categories of data. And then based on that processing activity, because those have a lot of depth, you'll see that you may need to do more kind of mini flowcharts per different processing activity. And then you want to identify the security and privacy controls in place. And the next slide here that we'll go to will kind of give you more of an overview. This is actually a project that we had here. It was a really big project for us. You can see starting on the bottom left, we have a bunch of data from third parties or all of our systems that are going to a data lake. It goes to a processor, goes to a data warehouse, goes to the customer health, which is going to be doing a lot of code and random things, goes to another database. Here you can already probably see some things like, look, there's going to be 3 separate databases full of basically the same data. And that's already a little bit more risky. But once you see a flow chart like that, or once you create it, you can then go and identify, all right, what security controls do I want to put in place? What are my data categories? Do I have a legal basis for processing? What access control do I have in place? Goes into a lot of other things like third-party systems. So starting with a high-level diagram like this will allow you to go and dig deeper and further into some of the problems or issues you want to remediate. And from there, we can go into some program metrics here. So, going off of data mapping, that's going to lead you into this area where you're going to want to create some statistics, some actionable statistics that you can relay back to the business that will allow you to further or bolster your program. So you're going to conduct a data map and you're really going to want to see, all right, well, what's risky? How can I relay that to the business in a good way? How can I show that this has value for the business? Well, the best way is to find a way to come up with some statistics for it. So we can go to the next slide here, Dave. It's less so statistics. It's more so, so this slide is going to be actually more so about maintaining your efforts as far as it goes into the data mapping. Statistics is a little bit later. Sorry, everybody. So some maintenance points here is going to be really creating scalable, simple process. Like I said, you really want to reduce the amount of clicks that you have. Reducing the amount of clicks will make things a lot easier. Have efficient monitoring, and that does go into a little bit more of the statistics. It's what do you actually want to measure? Don't measure for the sake of measuring because that's not helpful. Don't keep statistics that don't help you. That's just a waste of time. Understand which laws and regulations are going to apply, which also helps if you keep a law register. It's actually something that's required by ISO. It's a control as well. So understand which ones apply to you. If you're a global business, you're going to have a lot more, and then you can figure out a strategy of how you want to comply with that. A big one is don't add complex process until the program matures. I'll even add to don't add any complex processes ever, really, if you can. If you can simplify that and it's still compliant and does what you need it to do, keep it that way. Don't make it complex because that's the enemy of making it repeatable. Also, you want to only scale when you're ready. Don't start scaling when your program's not really ready for it. Once you have the resources or the bandwidth or the technology, then you can do so. But prior to that, I wouldn't really approach it that way. And then be flexible. The longer you stay at an organization, the more things are going to change. So you're going to really want to improve based on that. So you're going to have to change some things along the way. And we can go to the next slide here. All right, so some do's and don'ts. One, set up automation where possible, and don't just like anything in privacy or any program, don't set up automation for the sake of setting up automation. Do it where it's possible, where it's feasible, and where it'll actually help you. I don't know. There was this one, I think it was like a meme I saw once. It was like someone setting up automation, like they probably spent an hour, and then them maintaining that automation, they spent like 8 more hours or 12 more hours. So sometimes setting up that automation was going to make you spend a whole lot more time on just about everything. So only do it if necessary or possible. Work with other departments. Now, goes into a lot of what Colin said, really partnering with everybody. One thing here at KnowBe4, I knew our product dev team used Jira. I'm not going to try to integrate some other product for them to use or send out some surveys from a GRC tool. I'm going to be honest with you. For me, they were not going to fill it out. Straight up, there's absolutely no way that they were going to do this. They're busy people. So I was like, all right, I'm just going to integrate myself in their Jira projects. Well, that worked out very well for me. Now everything I need to get done gets done. I can communicate with them very well. And now they see this as something that as part of their process as well, and that they have to do, which is super great, honestly. And then establish some good metrics, what we'll get to later. We already talked about making things too complex. Don't make assumptions about certain areas of the business. Everything needs to be data driven. If you don't have data behind what you're saying, you might as well not really say it, because you can't really identify the problem well without having data, and you can't relay the problem well without having data. Executives want data behind anything that you're presenting them. So always have data behind that, which also goes into, suggesting recommendations without data. And then don't bring unnecessary processes into scope. Scoping is huge. Colin touched on it quite a bit, but scoping is going to be your best friend or it's going to be your enemy. A lot of organizations fall into the trap that it just becomes your enemy and you have to start over again. And then you start, you keep bringing down the scope. And honestly, in the beginning, do it right the first time. Really scope it well, spend time. Don't be afraid of spending. You're not wasting time if you spend a lot of time scoping. That is going to save you so much time in the future. Okay, and now for the next slide, Dave, we can go into more metrics, reporting, and socializing. So on the next slide, we'll see that there's program metrics and board metrics. A lot of these are very much the same. It really depends on your organization and your board. KnowBe4, for example, we're a security company, and our board has a lot of executives from, with a lot of other security backgrounds. So they do value more granular style metrics that we provide to them. However, some don't. So you can provide something more high level, like, really one of the most important numbers is how many data breaches have you had, or how many data leaks have you had, and what are the repercussions, financial impact, things of that nature. How many incidents have you had? But there are others that may prefer something a little bit more in depth, like risky third parties and other things of that nature. And really, out of this slide, I think that it's just really important to, take a look at the chart on the right-hand side and see which ones will apply to you the most. For example, if you're B2B, you're not going to get as many data subject requests. So that might not be a metric that provides you a lot of value. Maybe if it ramps up for some reason, then maybe that would provide you a little bit more value. That would be anomalous. So maybe something happened. But really identify which ones are right for your organization based on where you are currently and where your current maturity status is as for your privacy program. And on the next slide here, we can go over some program level metrics to consider. The last one gets a little more complicated. I really like my metrics to be actionable. And it took a lot of iterations to get to the metrics I have now. you are going to go through trial and error. Honestly, I went through a lot of trial and error trying to figure out, all right, well, I have these statistics. At first, it was kind of keeping statistics for the sake of statistics. And then, there's also unactionable statistics or ones that don't provide as much value, just like how many agreements have I redlined or how many DSARs do I have? Like, yes, those are good, but you want to kind of eventually get to a place where you can make them a little bit more granular. So for me, it's number of processes mapped by risk level. I really like that because it allows me to really see, all right, well, let's say I have 50 processes mapped and 10 of them are high risk, 20 is medium risk, then you have the low risk ones. All right, well, I'm really going to focus on these high risk ones. These are my priority. These are the ones I know that can affect the business, either financially, from a PR perspective, from whichever perspective. And I'm going to really harp on those in my risk management meetings and say, hey, how can we reduce this risk of this particular process? And then kind of focus on those one at a time. Another one is, oddly enough, the number of applicable laws. I think, once we presented this data to some executives, I think our CISO also reported it to the board, of applicable laws from a privacy perspective, people were like, what? There's that many that you have to take a look at and comply with? And I was like, yeah, that's it. And honestly, for some reason, it kind of like, some people were dumbfounded. They're like, oh, that's a lot more. And it kind of really informed them of the value of privacy and all of the things that we do that are a little bit less tangible, because that's a problem with either IT or security or privacy. Things aren't as tangible. You do not see, we don't generate a profit necessarily for the business. Our value comes from preventing the company from losing more money. And also there's other ways to provide value other than that, but that's one of the main reasons for compliance or security. Another one I have here is percentage of processes mapped versus processes identified. Now, this does not mean go identify 800 processes and then go try to map them one at a time. Again, I like to bring scoping into this. I'll look at, maybe it's it's the product development team, because to me, that's the most important one. There's 50 processes with them. All right, well, my goal is to do those because I think these are more high risk processes. These are super important. They involve customer data and I'm going to map them. So you want to increase the percentage of that. And then as your team grows, you can expand that out. And honestly, you're going to have many, like you're going to have HR, you're going to have product development, you're going to have your marketing, you're going to have all of these departments. And there's no way you're going to be able to focus on all of them. Even if you're like 2 people, if you're 3 people. So really you're going to want to identify those higher risk, those high priority, those important processes and focus on those, and then eventually ramp up to the other ones. And then for the last one here, this is a mouthful: active unresolved issues per process by potential violation type. Really, it's from the data maps or DPIAs I've conducted. How many issues are there per process? So let's say the process is the data lake. I identify 2 issues. What type? And so basically there's going to be 2 issues for that process. And then by potential violation type means that like what kind of GDPR violation. And that's because what's that website? It's like compliancesomething.com. It has all of the different data breaches and privacy violations that go into it. So some of them is like misuse of data, legal basis, security incident, things of that nature. So basically I categorize the issues based on the type of fine we will receive. This allows me to get a whole lot more granular and actually leverage more data and say, hey, these are the fines that are being given for this type of violation. We need to put resources into mitigating it. So that's kind of how I approach that, because once I can put a dollar sign to something, it really made things a whole lot easier. And then I will just spend just a tiny bit of time here. Okay, and I think this is for you, Colin.
Yeah, and I think this is probably a good place to piggyback on some of the things you were saying, Alessio, and also pick up on the thread I talked about earlier about, thoughtful engagement. You mentioned those program level type metrics. this, we don't have to spend too much time here because I think it should be evident in that you're tailoring your results depending on the audience, right? Between your collaborators versus your leadership and what goes in there. When I don't think that we typically don't recommend that, we're convening a weekly status meeting with, our project sponsor and every data mapping collaborator to talk about the progress of the project. But is there a more kind of efficient way to keep them updated on what the different status of those things that Leslie mentioned on the previous slide are? What's open in their team, right? If I'm a business leader completely divorced from privacy, or so I think, my main question for you is going to be, what do you need from my team, right? What's sitting open? What can I help you with? How can we, how can I make sure that nothing is outstanding for too long? And what are some of the next steps based on some of what Leslie talked about, right? And where I starting to identify risks and things like that. Are there any next steps? The earlier you can let people know that they need to start planning for some of these things and incorporating it into their, their planning process, I think, again, it makes you a stronger collaborator. So as you think about those collaborators, it's going to always be different, but I think of it as the people that help make sure that the data mapping gets done. Aspirationally, if you have a privacy champion model, I think that's a best case scenario, right? Where you can really empower some people throughout your organization that are responsible for different teams. And they're, of course, going to be the most interested on some of those metrics Leslie talked about. On the next slide, I'll cover the same thing just real quickly on gap analysis. I think one of the things that we always know is when giving the results of our work is who makes up the audience that we're delivering that work to. But I think an equally important thing, and where we get feedback that that we need to modify the presentation of our findings, for me, it usually comes down to not the audience, but understanding a bit more about them. So it's audience and risk appetite, right? And it's knowing what types of things do they find valuable. So of course, these 3 points on the bottom here line up to what Leslie was talking about earlier. We're going to have different metrics for different levels, so we can tailor it to the audience. But we really want to balance a clear articulation of a gap and a finding and why it's important. But then depending on your audience, I think this is an opportunity to really be on the front foot with your presentation of results. What's the next step? If a gap analysis is a snapshot in time, but the presentation of the results can be a forward-looking deliverable to understand what's next? How do we fix these things that we're saying are gaps, right? And as you go to leadership, again, if it's appropriate for your organization, sometimes they like to, they don't just want to hear about problems, they want to hear about the solution too, right? So the more of that you can bring to the discussion, the better. And then that last point there is, when you do that, make sure it's very clear what the call to action is. I think when we've delivered results, whether it's a gap analysis or anything else, and we check in with a client 60 days later to find out, are they taking action on any of those things that we talked about? I think too often when something has stalled and it's 60, 90 days later, and they're still, they tell us just in general terms, they're still discussing it internally. It's because the call to action wasn't clear enough, right? It's people didn't walk away with a clear plan on how are we going to fix this? Who is going to fix it? And what do we need in order to do it? Is it funding for something? Is it a new technology? Whatever it is, right? But I think that call to action is critically important. So that's just kind of a summary, I think, of, again, success factors, principles that make reporting on gaps more effective. And I think in terms of content, we can kind of leave it there, and Dave, maybe open it up to the Q&A and the panel discussion here.
That sounds terrific. Leslie and Colin, thanks so much for that excellent presentation. That's really great. Covered a lot of ground there, and now is the time for you out in the audience. We've got about 10 minutes left in the hour. So if you have some questions, please pop them in the chat or the question and answer, and we will go ahead and tackle them. And to start, Leslie, let me direct this first one to you. Throughout the whole program, both of you have been talking a lot about how critical it is this is not an isolated exercise, right? This is not the privacy team doing this by themselves. You absolutely have to have collaboration with functional teams, and you have to have buy-in and support from leadership in order to, take on this big lift basically within the organization. So again, Alessio, starting with you, in your experience, what are some ways that you feel like you've been able to successfully get buy-in and connection from the functional team leaders that you need to work with, and also from leadership? And I know one that kind of stuck out to me that you already shared was don't impose upon them particular new tools that they're not familiar with. I know you mentioned like the Jira system, it's already in place. So let's use something that they're familiar with. Let's speak their language. And so I thought that was already a fantastic answer to this question. But you have some others?
Yeah, no, for sure. There's quite a few ways you can go about it. And it does come back to also figuring out, what are the drivers for your organization? Like, why were you hired to do privacy? Or if you weren't hired to do privacy, were you just did privacy just fall on you? And why did that become a thing? Was it something being requested by your customers? Is it you're expanding somewhere and you have more compliance requirements? Are you going to start processing credit card data and you need to do a PCI audit and you want to get prepared for that? So it's really identifying what your driver is for that, and seeing, who are your champions, who are the ones who also kind of brought you on board, and really speak to them. Also, as you're identifying processing activities and other things in your organization, you're going to be surveying people. You're going to be partnering with other teams. So the more you partner with other teams, the more you can provide value for them, the easier it is to get resources for what you are trying to do, because then you become a very integral member of the team. For me at KnowBe4, one big thing is identifying the processes. So for me, I started identifying the different processes that privacy is involved in. And I saw one for us as a B2B company. We were involved in a lot of sales and, data protection agreements, the transfer impact assessments that we have to do, making sure everything is up to date on the website, like privacy documentation, all of that stuff. And customers really requested that, and they really responded well once we had really good documentation. So basically, I was able to get a lot of support because I was helping speed up sales. And I said, hey, for me to be able to do this, and for us to be in however many countries we are in with our affiliates or selling, I need more resources to do X, Y, and Z, because look at all of these requests that we have. Look at all the things that we need to do to even be able to sell into these countries from a privacy perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense. Certainly, any leaning on activities that are going to generate more revenue is going to attract the attention of leadership in the business in general. Something that popped into my mind as I was listening to you, Alessio, was I heard something in a session room at an IAPP conference once. It was just, I remember this, it was really, really popped out. If you're going to be working with functional teams, say IT security or business and sales team or customer service or whatever, and that this project is coming up, maybe approach them proactively and then start those relationships before you even get started, and then see what they need. Is there anything our team can do to help you, and start off on that foot? So you're offering help, so you're trying to make it a mutually beneficial collaboration, as opposed to just approaching teams with, this is what I need from you guys. So Colin, I'm going to guess in all your experience, you have some thoughts on this as well.
Just really quickly to say I agree. I think there's ways to attack it on multiple fronts as well. I think for a lot of privacy and data protection professionals that might be trying to kind of evangelize privacy within their organization, the market is shifting, right? You hear a lot about people talking about privacy and trust as a competitive advantage. We haven't talked about that in the presentation, but much like it speeds up your sales process, Alessio, why does it speed up your sales process? It's because when you build that trust with your customers, I think for me, it's a slow burn to be able to do that effectively. Not everyone just buys into, yes, privacy is going to, that's a huge competitive advantage for us. But I think that's one tact you can take while doing some of the more tactical, wins that ingratiate you with, other people throughout the business. And I saw somebody put in the chat about the clarifying the what's in it for me, right? That's all of what we just spoke about is a way, but you have to be very clear and you have to be honest about that, what's in it for me. And definitely agree with the point that was put in there. And I think, Alessio, I think that's what you were doing, right? When you when you're starting to add value for those people, now that's a message you can turn around and throw in there.
Yep.
Yeah, fantastic. And Colin, speaking of the chat, thank you, Jacques, for sharing that. And just for those of you that may not have access to the visual here, great overview and agree with the best practice recommended. I found the executive buy-in support must be in place. Otherwise, the effort becomes tenfold. What's in it for me, for your stakeholders that you're engaging, and more ownership you can push to the business owners across the enterprise, the better the program success. That's really an interesting point that we might highlight for the audience as well. I was on a client call the other day, and I remember we were talking with our sponsor, and the sponsor was stating very clearly that when going out to the functional teams that we're going to be working with, really wanted to make sure that they understood that they were going to be active participants and really engage with the process, so that when the data mapping, gap analysis, remediation, is kind of completed, there's some lingering ownership, as opposed to we're going to do this for you. We really need to engage with you so that relationship can continue. Terrific. Well, we have just a couple minutes left. Thank you for engaging in the chat here. If anybody has any last minute questions, you can pop them in there. Let me move on to another question that we have, which is regards the use of the technical tools that in order to accomplish these tasks. So I'm curious to your thoughts, and Alessio, again, let's kind of start with you. Whether like existing in-house technical tools and programs can do the job, Excel and Microsoft Office Suite, kind of standard tools that most organizations have. Would you suggest kind of starting with what's in-house so that you don't have to ask for that extra spend to bring in some of the emerging off-the-shelf privacy management software tools that are available out there? And then if not, if you think those tools can be really valuable, how do you decide when to take the plunge and maybe go ask for that spend to be able to bring those tools in? And what are some of the, obviously it's gonna be different for every organization, but what are some of the questions you might ask, or the factors involved in making those decisions about whether to use in-house tools or whether you want to go out and purchase some, more specific tools?
Sure. And from my experience, it's always best to start without using a tool. Especially when you're starting out, you can do everything with Excel. You can do everything with Word, especially if the budget is tight. If for some reason they want to give you money to get a tool, by all means, go get a tool. But if they, you don't have the budget, it's not budgeted yet, you just started, you can accomplish everything with Excel. There's tons of templates online. There's various ways for you to manage it. You could have like your own Google Drive or your own, I can't think of OneDrive, the Microsoft one, but all of those allow you to store something a little bit more centrally. It's harder to search, and there's not as many cool features and all the bells and whistles, but it does what you need it to do. And as far as keeping it simple, it really keeps it simple. Unless you start leveraging some crazy templates, I don't suggest that either. Make it super easy for you. And once you're a little bit more mature, so it's really once you start scaling and you increase the size of your team, you increase your scope. You are no longer just really servicing a small area, or you start servicing, a kind of a broader area, and you want to be able to keep metrics, and you want to be able to do that super easily. That's when I would really go and say, hey, I need to start looking for a tool, because usually by then you've ingrained yourself more in the organization. You have those partner connections inside of the org. And usually you start having a little bit more political capital to say, hey, I'm requesting budget for this. This is what we need. Our team is growing. Also, you might have a compliance department that uses a different GRC tool for something, or another team that uses it. So you can kind of make those comparisons, like just like that team has that one tool, well, we need this tool to do what we need to do.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for that, Alessio. Just one last question. Actually, we're just hit the top of the hour. We're out of time here, unfortunately. We'll have to do a follow-up to this session. So let me take this time to thank you both so much for your time. Obviously, very busy professionals here, lots of other priorities, but really appreciate, Alessio, you making some time for us today, and Colin, for you also to join us today and share your experience and expertise with the audience. So I hope this was useful to everybody out there. As you can see on the slide in front of you here, we've all made our contact information available, and you're going to be getting a follow-up email, as I mentioned earlier at the top of the program, with a PDF copy of the slides and a link to access the recording of this program if you want to go back and review any of it. Please feel free to contact any of us directly. And with that, I would like to thank everybody for joining us today, and I will take us to a program close. Thanks, everybody.